Betty, and Jerome for joining as well. I'm Fars. I'm Vice President of Business Development at Prompt.io, which is a texting platform being used by nonprofits and advocacy groups around the world. A little bit of a quick setup of what we're here to discuss. Obviously this is called, the Textpert panel, how to text your way to more donations. The idea is to kind of identify how texting is to be used most effectively, why it's used, and how to get the most out of it for your organization. So like I mentioned, we're joined here by Stratcom, which is a leading digital firm based out of Canada on fundraising for nonprofits. Betty Wan is Manager of Digital and Mobile Solutions, and Jerome Chung is Director of Digital and Mobile Solutions. So we have a great panel here with a ton of combined experience in the space and how to effectively fundraise. As Tamila mentioned, a little bit of housekeeping. So this is going to be an interactive webinar. So there will be polls, which I'm looking forward to and seeing what the results are, that will start at the beginning of every section and then read out the results towards the end. The other thing to note is, like I mentioned, Stratcom is a Canadian-based firm. Obviously, compliance-wise, regulatory-wise, legal-wise, there's distinctions and differences between how things can be done in the US versus how things can be done in Canada. There's nuanced details in terms of broad strokes of how to get the most out of text messaging for fundraising. It's going to be relatively the same, but I wanted to highlight that just so folks know that consult legal counsel for your respective countries, since we have folks on this webinar from both countries. So that's kind of the starting point, and we're going to kind of kick things off by identifying what the 3 topics of coverage are going to be here. So what we're looking over is importance of mobile and text. So this is explaining the why, like why is this important? And then the next is going to be the how, which is how to fundraise with text. And the last is the expert tips and tricks. Like I mentioned, these are going to be broadly applicable across organizations, as Jerome and Betty are going to discuss that in great detail. But we can go ahead and start things off with our first poll, which Tamila, I think you're going to launch here in a second. I'll go ahead and read off. There we go. The first poll, unread text. How many texts on your phone are unread? And then how many emails are unread in your inbox? So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and make a selection there. And we'll go ahead and we'll continue on with the conversation while we're waiting on those results to kind of start pouring in. So I'm going to start with you, Jerome, as we just start discussing the how, or the how piece being the importance of mobile and text. I'd love to hear broad strokes, and we'll hone in on details here, but the broad strokes, if you wouldn't mind articulating what you've experienced in the space between the importance of using texting versus other channels and how it kind of fits into your strategy.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Fars, and thanks to Tamila and everybody who's joined us. Yeah, I guess the question is, why text? Why should we care about text? Well, obviously, many of you who run fundraising programs are using different channels, email, phone, for instance. One has to remember that, a lot of these other channels, they kind of have declining contact rates or open rates, like email. Nowadays, I think you can get 10 to 20% open rate on an email. Still effective because of the low cost of email, but obviously with increasing spam filters, that's becoming less effective. Contact rates for telemarketing, for instance, in Canada are about 50%, meaning that like 50% of any given list that you try to phone through, you just won't be able to reach. I think it's even lower in the US. I think it's around 30%. And I think there's just an overall transformation happening with phones that, if you look at the statistics, you can see that every year landline subscriptions are decreasing. And at the same time, cell phone subscriptions are increasing. So at some point in the future, I don't know when, landlines are going to be a minority of the phone numbers that you have in any given database. And even if you don't do texting, right? if you just want to keep your database up to date, if you do telemarketing, it's a good idea to start now in terms of collecting cell phone numbers from your supporters and your constituencies. In Canada, we don't have a cell phone book, so you can't look up cell phones. I think you can do that in the US. Maybe later you can comment on that first.
Sure.
But in Canada, you cannot. So it's a good time right now to start reaching out to your supporter base and asking them for cell phones. And then on top of that, another really good reason to use text is that it has a very low cost. It's similar to email in the sense that it costs very little to communicate with a large list of supporters or whatnot. Pars, maybe you can just comment on the US cell phone lookup.
Yeah. Well, so in the US, one option, obviously having a form field on your website for folks to enter their information on their own is fantastic. Another option would be there's a lot of list vendors out there who can go out and identify cohorts based on interest levels and previous giving history to identify who might be a right target for you to engage with as well. And there's a whole strategy around that in terms of what we would do once you have that list, working towards like an opt-in status, so on and so forth. But the rules are a bit more permissive here in the US in terms of the acquisition of those initial lists. And we could certainly offer guidance on that front as well. Jerome, one thing I'm wondering is, you mentioned email. Well, you mentioned the declining landline rates, which I had never thought about before, but that's true because I don't have a landline. I only have a cell phone.
Neither do I.
Yeah, and it actually this question actually harkens back to the poll because you specifically wanted us to ask how many emails you have unread, because I think the prevailing theory is it's going to be a lot more than the number of texts that you have left unread. And so I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of those open and more importantly, like the click-throughs of email-based fundraising versus text-based. I have an opinion that both have a place in nonprofit fundraising, but I would assume that a good portion of the folks here on this call are much more familiar with email-based fundraising than text-based. So I'd be curious to know what your take is on where those two fit in and juxtaposed to each other.
Yeah, by no means am I advocating that in one or the other. Obviously, all these channels are best used as an integrated package. Email has the longer format, which is great for articulating an important case for support. But text really has a very high read rate, probably 90% or more. And it'll be interesting to see from our poll how many people have any texts that are unread on their phone. I certainly don't. It does grab my attention, and I definitely check out every text. And one of the reasons why, because it does have a short form, right? It is very short, and therefore fast and convenient to consume. And that's another kind of disadvantage of text, is that it is sort of short, and a reason why you should sort of use it integrated with other channels, as we will sort of see in some of our case studies that we'll touch upon later on. What I'd like to sort of recommend at this point is really that because it's really not extra work, that people really start basically doing list building of their cell phone numbers. And there's lots of very simple ways of kind of doing that while you maintain your ongoing fundraising program, right? So in my experience, working with nonprofits and charities, usually when we look at their list, because we are able to flag which numbers are cell phone numbers and which are not, they only have about 30% or less that are cell phones. So by and large, a lot of people don't have, a lot of organizations have not collected a lot of cell phones. So that's the first thing I would say to do, is like have your list flagged for mobile phones if you haven't already distinguished the two types, just to find out where you stand in terms of how many cell phone numbers you have. And then in any other sort of direct response contact that you're running, try to integrate cell phone capture in that. So for instance, if you're doing social media advertising, make sure to add a cell phone field. It's very obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. a lot of people believe, that adding an extra field for cell phone may suppress response to a social media ad. But I think you have to consider how valuable a cell phone is. That you can, for instance, you can reach a person in two different ways, both by voice phone, actually three different ways: voice phone, voicemail, and by text. Right. So it's very valuable in that sense, and given the high read rate of text, again, super valuable. So I think it's worth adding that field there. If you're sending out any emails, fundraising emails, newsletters, add a link to a web form where you can try to capture that cell phone number. If you're doing telemarketing, it is very easy to add at the end of the script, a soft ask for the cell phone. Even donors who have just said no to the donation, they still support you, right? They may not be ready to give you a donation at that given time, but they'll be able to they'll probably be willing to disclose their cell phone number. We also have a use case with an Ontario union where we sent both an email and a broadcast voicemail, right, to ask members to offer up their cell phone numbers, and we were able to capture about 18% of the list. So I think so there are very simple ways of doing that. It's not very expensive. And I'd say the last way is, use a short code on your promotional material. If you're running ads, if you're TV ads or radio or posters or whatever, add a short code. I recently had somebody ask, well, why not we use a QR code? Why not use a QR code? Well, the short code, which is a 5-digit code that you text to, that basically you have to send your cell phone number. You capture it as a result of that response versus a QR code, which often it just launches a web form, and you can have a field for a cell phone number there, but you're not necessarily going to have full capture of that information. So I think that there's some very easy things that we've talked about here that you can start building up your cell phone list.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I would add on to the short code piece, whether it's a short code or a regular 10-digit number, whatever it is having that number with the ability to kind of text into opt-in, listed on print media, digital media, on the websites, a very simple ask text support or whatever the organizational name is to this number, and then use that as kind of like the trigger for the opt-in flow as well. So that's fantastic. And another point that you raised that's worth going into is the desire to kind of the importance of building that opt-in list, especially here in the US.
Yes.
You could look at that as the kind of in parallel to that email list. How valuable is that email list when you're trying to do fundraising or any sort of ladder engagement based motion with your supporters? The same is also true for that list of cell phone numbers that are opting in on your website. To your point, Jerome, if you think that the barrier is too high to require that field on your phone and you're going to get lower conversion rates on the join page, then one similar recommendation is just to unrequire that field in an A/B test. Do a 2 week long variant of this is required for the cell phone field and then it's not required, and see how many folks drop off or stay consistent in terms of going through that opt-in flow, which is a very simple way to kind of test this out. Well, let's do this. Let's move on a bit.
Can I just add, just for the Canadians on the webinar, I'll just point out that it is a common misbelief that Canadian charities require opt-in to text either their list or anything. That's not true. So that's an American requirement, and just keep that in mind that Canadian charities and political parties are exempt from CASL, which is the Canadian Anti-Spam legislation.
Awesome. Thanks for setting that up. So let's go see what the results are of the poll that we submitted. Tamila, do we have poll results that you can surface?
Yes. 1 second. Let me figure. I can. Oh, no.
We'll keep going as you work that out. I'm very curious to see what the results are that folks say. So we'll move on a bit into kind of topic number 2, which is how to effectively integrate texting into your fundraising campaign. And so with that, we're supposed to segue into another poll. We'll hold until we figure out what the results of this poll are, and then maybe towards the end of this session, we'll go ahead and go into it. But with this section, Betty, I'd love to start by kicking it over to you and having a discussion around the importance of multi-channel strategy. So we kind of touched on this with Jerome, where email fits in, where text fits in, I'm just using those two as an example, but there's obviously, we know, multiple ways of engaging folks for whatever the ask is. I'm curious what your stance, what your position is, or what your thoughts are on kind of that multi-channel strategy. And real quick, we got the poll results before you answer. So number one, how many texts on your phone are unread? 0 had 63% response rate, and then the rest of them were 13%. So 63% of people have 0 unread text messages on their phone, compared to how many emails in your inbox are unread? 44% said 100 plus. So there in and of itself lies kind of the answer to the importance of using texted engagement tool. So sorry, Betty, I interrupted that section. So the question was the importance of multi-channel strategy, and potentially what those channels even are, and what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, basically I am echoing Jerome's point from earlier, but where, when we sort of recommend that charities get into fundraising via text or incorporating texting into their fundraising campaigns, we're not saying that, oh, you drop doing emails or you stop phoning. Obviously, as Jerome said earlier, all those channels are a little bit different, and while there might be some overlap, you are going to capture different segments of your audience through each channel. What we have found in the past, especially with charities who are a little bit slower to kind of incorporate text as a channel, as opposed to, for instance, political parties or labor who have been kind of incorporated the medium a lot quicker, is that there's kind of a hesitation to really fully commit. So they will kind of add texting as a little add-on to the main campaign, and sort of not fully incorporate it with the larger strategy. So we do find that there is limited effectiveness with texting when they kind of aren't willing to fully commit. So what we recommend is, when you come up with a fundraising strategy for Giving Tuesday, or perhaps you have a significant occasion on which you want to sort of pilot texting or start incorporating texting into your larger fundraising strategy, you kind of want to, I'm sure you plan out your email campaign, your phoning campaign, your direct mail campaign, if you use direct mail, with intention, and sort of all of those components are kind of well blended into each other. So text is the same. I think sort of starting out a donation campaign, knowing that you're going to incorporate text and kind of being very intentional about it from the get-go, that just results in, way more success than if you kind of say, maybe we'll try texting, and then kind of, we'll just text this little segment and see what happens. Usually you kind of get out of it what you put into it. So definitely recommend kind of approaching it sort of, I guess, being bold about it if you can afford to be. One use case I'll briefly mention, and I guess we can name names. So Alzheimer's Society of Canada, who we worked with for the past 2 Giving Tuesdays. From the very first campaign, we worked with the folks there. They were very intentional in their campaign strategy. They brought on other vendors who were working with them in terms of an email campaign. And I think the process was very seamless for both us and the other vendors and Alzheimer's Society, because we kind of had an idea of all the pieces that would fall into place. And we did see very good success, especially in the second year of the campaign. So, there was intention. They kind of timed emails versus texts. So, you weren't like sending an email and a text at the same time to one donor, because that might be a little bit too much. If you get an email and then 5 seconds later you get a text from the same charity, that might kind of feel a little bit overwhelming for the donor. But, they sort of planned out the strategy from the get-go, I guess, over a month out. And then we timed the emails, we created the scripting with intention, and I think they really saw good results as a result.
Nice. Nice. And I'm wondering, Camilla, if you could launch the second poll we have here, which is, have you used text as a communication channel in fundraising, and ask questions around what channel you've been using, because that actually dovetails a little bit off of what you had just said, Betty, and actually is something that I'm really curious about, which is, and we'll actually have an answer to this, right? Because we have the poll here, but I'm wondering if there are folks whose organizations have a bit of hesitancy on exploring other channels, which is totally understandable. Adding a new tech stack increases everybody's workload. There's a whole host of things that happen when you add to the tech stack. And so I understand if there's hesitancy to do that. I'm wondering what you've found to be effective to get over kind of like the organizational and institutional hurdle of like going forward with a new strategy, and what we could potentially learn from that.
So I guess I'll start, and Jerome, feel free to jump in. In terms of like, realistically speaking, we've had potential charity clients who were, hesitant to kind of take the leap. We've had clients who are more adventurous. It helped that there was a champion on the client team who was excited to kind of try new mediums and channels and experiment a little bit. And of course, with every channel, there's a bit of a onboarding / experimentation process where you're sort of figuring out your strategy, you're testing things to see how they work. So there is a bit of a process there. And I think one major hurdle for a lot of, especially charity clients, is obviously, ROI is king. So, folks want to guarantee on the return on investment. And it's a little bit hard to gauge the return on investment you're going to have with a single iteration or a single round of texting. So we've seen in the past where charity clients were willing to try it out, but they didn't see, decent ROI with a single round of texting. So they're like, maybe this isn't a channel that works for us. But what we see is over time, as you kind of familiarize your audience, so the donor base or the supporter base, who you're going to text, you sort of keep texting them over a period of months or years, they grow accustomed to the fact that, oh, this charity is now reaching out to me and communicating with me via text. So you need time to kind of warm them up to the idea that they're going to receive text from you. And it also helps with charities to, again, be more intentional in the way you're reaching out to your donors via text. I mean, folks have very well planned out email campaigns. They have different content. They know, I guess sometimes not, but sometimes what you're going to be emailing folks about months in advance. Text is the same way. And recently we've had clients who have sort of planned out their texting strategy for basically the entire fiscal year. And we've seen great success with that. So yeah, it really helps to be intentional. It really helps to kind of want to, take the plunge a little bit, experiment. It also helps to test different approaches. I'll get into that a little bit later in the webinar, but
Yep.
Text is very similar to email in the sense that you can do lots of A/B testing, test different audience segments, test different scripting, lots of dimensions you can kind of test and tweak and see what works for your audience. So I'd say like committing to it kind of, again, just to echo what I said earlier, you get into it, you get out of it what you put into it. So it really helps if you are really intentional, think through your sort of plan or ideas in advance. And obviously, I think both the team at Prompt and both the team at Stratcom would be super happy to kind of, be a part of that planning process if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, for sure, it really helps to be really intentional in the way that you approach this channel and incorporate it with your other strategies in a meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jerome, I'm gonna chime in real quick on this piece because you're gonna go really deep in the layer here with your use cases coming up.
Yeah.
But I found what you said there, Betty, was really interesting. Because I experienced it too on my end, where there's two schools of thought. One is I need to see the ROI today. The other is this is part of an ongoing nurture campaign to have alternative engagement channels to leverage for supporter engagement. And it's just such a clear differentiator in terms of what the results are that we're seeing, where when you're just trying to hit folks up with a specific ask, with a specific CTA once, twice, and you're off and done, it doesn't tend to go as well as the nurture campaign, because what you end up doing on the nurture campaign is what we kind of discussed in the first topic section, Jerome, which is you identify the cohorts who want to be engaged with via text versus email versus phone, and then you can have a much more honed and specific ask for them than you would generalizing a message out to a whole cluster of folks saying, go ahead and donate today. So I love that framing, being deliberate about it, being intentional about it, and you get out of it exactly as much as you put into it is 100% spot on. Also what we're seeing on our end as well, Betty. But that being said, Jerome, we have some text fundraising use cases here that also kind of talk through what I just said, but goes super into the detail and provides examples. So I'll kick it over to you to kind of go through these.
Thanks. Yeah, and just to add to that last point, like I know people can have some reservations about getting into texting, but in our experience, on any given broadcast, you have a very, very low subscribe rate that comes back, 1% or usually even less than 1%. So if that can reassure people that you're not offending, your list, your supporters, it reminds me a lot of the trepidation people have to do telemarketing, right? Again, people are afraid of using that particular channel because they're worried about maybe offending people or turning people off. But again, in our experience, even donors who say, no, I don't want to give, they're very supportive of your organization. They often say, but I'm not going to give this time, but good luck, right? Like, there's a lot of support out there. It may not always be in dollars, but there's definitely good morale out there. Yeah, so let's take a look at some of the use cases. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and we're trying to test different types of ways of using text, but these are sort of a cluster of some of the ones that we've used a lot with our clients. We talked about when you start texting, you're going to be using a new medium with an audience, and they do need to get used to it. So maybe that's not the best place to start with an ask. But obviously, we often in fundraising, we're always talking about the importance of stewardship. So this is what I would say is it's a good place to start is your texting program is really start with a stewardship message out to your supporters and your donors. It's always important to thank everybody who supports us. And one of our clients, Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital, prepared a really lovely little segment highlighting the story of the hopeful story of one of their patients. And we sent a text out on that. One of the things they really took advantage of was the prompt feature called the Instant app, which is a micro landing site that can be put together very easily on the prompt platform. And it looked great. You basically, people receive a link, you click that link, it launches the browser on the cell phone. So from there, you're sort of leaving the short form of the text, which I kind of see as a headline, right? It's like, this is why you guys maybe chose the name prompt. It basically gets people's attention and prompts them to follow the link and read in more depth about a particular story. In this case, was a beneficiary. I believe the first one they actually sent on International Gratitude Day, so that was well timed. And it had, it could host pictures of the patient and copy and text describing their condition and the treatment they were receiving in the hospital. I think in a future another text that Holland Bloorview sent, they actually sent a video of another patient recorded a video for the donor. So I think that's a lovely way of sort of starting off your conversation by text with your audience.
Jerome, real quick, just to chime in and reiterate, you mentioned two things there that were always top of mind for us when we talk to customers is anything that ties the message back to your mission is welcomed. Yeah, because that's an altruistic. I want you to know that you're supporting us and your support is helping this outcome. through stewardship is a very, very good message that is almost always welcomed. The other one is, you mentioned the redirect to rich media, which is another interesting thing we've been seeing, is using text to get the visibility to redirect to the other venues that you want folks' attention on, such as a video, such as like a long form page on the website, or a PDF or whatever else. Yeah. We've seen a lot of that happening as well, and it's been really, really effective. So anyway, just wanted to chime in on those points as you continue on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really effective way of using it, like using the attention grabbing nature of text, but then redirecting to a longer form where you can fully articulate either your stewardship thank you message, share a story. I mean, it's fundraising, it's all about storytelling. So we need, fundraisers need longer canvases than 160 characters. And that's what I appreciate about that particular feature. Holland Bloorview also used text effectively for their recent Cape for Kids fundraising event. So they use that actually to register participants, and that's another way that you can use text again to leverage your fundraising program. Again, I'm sure they weren't just using text alone. It was integrated with probably email, social, and whatever. But again, this can be another tool in your toolkit to grab people's attention and get those registration rates up. For those of you who use telemarketing, again, text can be integrated quite well with telemarketing. We have been using it together with David Suzuki Foundation, for instance, which is a Canadian environmental group, to send a cultivation text prior to a telephone campaign. And the text can be some kind of engagement. Again, it's not necessarily a direct ask, but rather it could be a stewardship type message, thanking people, giving them more awareness of what's going on. I believe one of the first ones we did with David Suzuki Foundation was a quiz about environmental issues. So it was a lighthearted way of getting people to think about different environmental issues by taking the quiz, and then the answers were returned to them actually at the final panel in the instant app. So that's the idea there is really to use that cultivation text to increase contact and conversion rates once the telemarketing campaign launches. The other way to integrate with telemarketing is as a follow-up text. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a large part of your list in any given telemarketing campaign, you just won't reach, right? In the US, it's up as high as 70%. You will not be able to reach. In Canada, maybe 50. So that's a part of your list that is still, there are still some good potential donors there. It's just, how do you reach them? Again, so what we've been doing with Alzheimer's Society, actually, of Canada, is sending a follow-up text after we completed a telemarketing campaign with just like a message saying, hey, we were reaching out to our supporters. We weren't able to reach you, but if you'd like more information, please return this keyword, right? And then in return for the keyword, people get a link to the donation page. And I think when we first started this, we were thinking, oh, we'll get a few one-time gifts, that's it. But actually, a number of people actually signed up for monthly gifts, right? And I guess the point here is that you may not get a tremendous amount from that follow-up, but again, because the low cost of text, it's still effective to do, because for a handful of donations, that'll give you a positive ROI. And then the last use case we've been seeing a lot of our clients use is a direct ask for donation, direct donation ask. Again, I'll return to the David Suzuki Foundation. They have been quite effective in using this both on Giving Tuesday, but also on David Suzuki's birthday. David Suzuki, by the way, if folks don't know, is an environmentalist and broadcaster, sort of Canada's David Attenborough. And he's beloved by Canadians and of course his supporters, and that birthday text was a very, very effective way of raising money through direct donation ask. So those are some of the use cases we've developed so far. I think text, there's the sky's the limit really with what different things we could use to fundraise with text, but we'll leave it there for now.
Nice. And yeah, I would say that there, as far as I've seen, there's no limit to Stratcom's creativity with devising a campaign behind an objective, whatever that objective might be, whether it's a birthday, it's Giving Tuesday, what have you, and every organizational need is different. So I would say that those could also be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But these are really, really good examples of use cases. I see there's questions flowing in. We do have a Q&A section in the last 10 minutes of this our webinar today. So we'll get to those. Please keep funneling those in. In the meantime, Tamila, can you go ahead and generate the poll results for us? Oh, there we go. Okay, so have you used text as a communication channel to fundraise? 42% have said yes. 27% have said, so 31% said no, they only use email. And 27% said they use a combination of email and telemarketing. So pretty healthy, nearly 50-50 split in terms of usage of text as an engagement platform versus not. So hopefully,
That's
whether
great.
you're using text or not, this information is valuable and important. And with our last section, we're actually not going to have any more polls. So we're going to get into tips and tricks to get the most out of your texting campaign. I remember thinking about this when we phrased this section, also in the context of you put in as much as you get out. And so I have a little bit of back and forth in terms of tips and tricks being associated with it, because to your point earlier, Betty, you do need to kind of contribute the resources and the calories to make sure it's effective in your texting strategy. But there are universal standards as well, which are things that consistently across the board you want to keep in mind as you put together your playbook for a texting program. And so, Betty, I'll start off with you. Why don't I kick it over to you in terms of the texting best practices that you have top of mind to share with the crowd?
Sure. So some of this I've mentioned earlier, and so is Jerome, but we find it super important for those who are trying out texting to kind of plan out and launch a sort of multi-level or multi-step plan or strategy in terms of engaging with your donors or supporters via text. So one thing that we stress with new clients, especially in the charity sector, is if you're texting a group of people for the very first time, you don't want it to be like a direct donation ask. Because imagine you get a text from a number that you don't recognize, and the first ask is, hey, can you give me money? That can be a little bit like make you kind of go, right? So to echo, the points that Jerome and I both have made earlier, you kind of want to warm up the audience, engage with them via text, kind of familiarize them with the fact that you are going to be reaching out to them via text. Build that rapport via text. Like you can send emails, but it's a little bit different communicating with them via text, because it's such an intimate medium, because we have our phones with us 24/7 is the first thing you look at when you wake up, last thing you look at before you go to bed. At least that's the case for me, which is a little bit concerning, but so there is an intimacy there that you can cultivate that you necessarily don't cultivate with a channel like email, which is more of like a bulk broadcast. And you also make it less you lessen the chance that you'll have some of your donors or supporters unsubscribe. Some of them might be a little bit off put by you texting them for the very first time and it being a donation ask. If you kind of plan out a strategy months, like for the next few months or even the next fiscal, say like, oh, on this month we have an event, so we're going to reach out to them, ask them to register. The next month, maybe we'll reach out with a donation ask. Maybe the following month we will reach out and like send out a shareable or like a resource that they might find interesting. That keeps it interesting for folks who are opted into your texting campaign. you kind of want to stay on and see what you're going to get next from the charity or the nonprofit that you're in effect texting with, right? So you kind of want to keep it interesting, keep it fresh, keep the content varied. One other thing is there's sort of a balancing act that has to take place between A2P and P2P. So folks who are not familiar with those terms, so application to person is sort of bulk or broadcast texting, where you're sort of sending out a single message to sort of the ether. And peer-to-peer is more engaged, one-to-one texting, where you have, you send out a message, the person responds, and you have a live agent. So someone on your a staff member, or perhaps even a volunteer who is like speaking or communicating with that person via text in real time. So to speak on behalf of like what we do with our clients in terms of Canadian clients, and bearing in mind the compliance rules and the differences there between the US and Canada, we employ this approach where the first message is typically a broadcast where it's sent out to the entire list or the audience that the client targets. And then some of the responses we reroute using a keyword bot, which Prompt can do, and it's super helpful for us, and some non-standard replies. So folks who may have questions or may have some other comments, they get routed to live agents. So we are sort of able to do that balancing act of, it's personable, but it's still efficient and it keeps costs down, because obviously, there's not as much person hours that are committed on that campaign. Obviously, it's a little bit different, or very different for the States because of TCPA regulations and all that. So what I found, and if I may refer a little bit to what I found with folks south of the border in the political world, is a lot of folks are focusing on building that opt-in list. So again, echoing Farz's point, they're super important to build an SMS opt-in list. So perhaps the first touch point is a peer-to-peer text message to kind of warm up and engage your audience, and work on building that SMS opt-in list, either via that peer-to-peer touch point or through a different medium. And once you have that list kind of formed, you can reach out, sort of have a concerted strategy across a number of months or even the fiscal year, as I've said earlier, and you can test out different messaging. So in terms of what works best in terms of messaging for your audience, that's a good segue to, I guess, my next tip/trick is to test and test and test. So I've said this earlier as well, but text is a lot like email in that you can do really robust A/B testing. So, test different segments of your audience, test different messaging, test different like dates and times to send your SMS. We found that for many of our clients, the best time to send a text message is around lunchtime or mid-afternoon, Tuesday to Thursday, because you kind of get lower response rates on the weekend or when it approaches the weekend. But again, that might not be the case necessarily for your audience. So you definitely want to test that. You also want to test things like, if you're doing a direct ask, different donation amounts. You also want to test what I've mentioned before, levels of personalization. Perhaps you want to run campaigns that are more peer-to-peer, personalized, heavily personalized with lots of back and forth. Maybe what works better for you and is, get you the best ROI is a very sort of straightforward A2P or broadcast SMS campaign. So you want to test that out as well. This is not in the this is not in the charity sector, but this is a use case that I've sort of heard from someone south of the border. They work for a nonprofit and they have a robust A2P texting campaign. And what they did was they actually tested sending out email length SMS, which, as someone who has worked in the texting sphere for 6 years, it's like, that sounds bonkers to me, because you're talking about many, many lengthy texts. But they said, hey, we tested it and like it worked for our audience. So perhaps down the line, that'll result in a high churn rate for them. But what's amazing is that they sort of were brave enough to test such a radical approach, and it apparently really worked for them. So definitely encourage you to do lots of testing. And because not all of these messages, or if you sort of follow our suggestions, not all of these messages are going to be direct asks. So you might not see an ROI with each message, but things like, response rates, contact rates, those are sort of good indicators of how effective was, my SMS campaign. What can I do differently? So things like that. And yeah, sorry, last thing I'll add is what we found in the past, because we've done lots of testing for our Canadian clients and just on our own with all of these metrics. And we found that often testing leads to more questions. So I guess my only tip in terms of that is test again. You have new metrics and new dimensions to test, which is always very exciting with a medium like SMS, where there's lots left to be explored.
That's awesome, Betty. And it, every time I hear y'all talking, it just brings up all these other thoughts I have and questions and things that I wanted to kind of contribute here. And one of them was, in the interest of testing. So one thing that you'll notice with text, because as Betty mentioned, it's a much more intimate means of communication. You're on their phone's always on them. So one thing that is worth considering in terms of tips and tricks of how to construct your message to somebody would be to actually literally just strike a more conversational tone, as opposed to being incredibly formal the way you might be with an email ask. Something a little bit more personal is really useful. So part of that could be, actually just personalizing the message itself. Hi, first name, how's your day? I hope you'll support. That's one thing. I mean more in terms of like, it's okay to kind of let your hair down a little bit in terms of how formal the language itself is. And the other piece are emojis, which I know it sounds kind of silly to bring up that within the context of like a overall campaign strategy for fundraising, but emojis themselves are also really like a personal way to connect with somebody and make it seem more conversational. And so that's another thing that is worth, to Betty's point, test. Try it out and see kind of the response rates that you're getting based on the lack of formality and the more usage of things like emojis. And the last thing I wanted to add on the testing piece is something that we've been seeing on our side has been what we refer to as MMS, so like rich multimedia messaging. So for example, sending an image or sending a video or a GIF perhaps, like something along those lines is also a really interesting way to kind of mix things up, because I'm sure y'all have seen when you get an MMS, it actually shows the image file itself on your phone as opposed to having to click through to something. And that's a really effective way to just immediately, bam, get right in front of somebody and have them react to your messaging. We're going into the last few minutes of this session, so I really would love to hop over to the Q&A. Jerome, is there anything you wanted to add on before I did that?
No, let's go to the Q&A.
Cool. Oops, I skipped over. There we go. Okay, so let me go ahead and read the messages. Camilla, you've been kind enough to kind of sort through them and generate a list for me to read off. So I'll go ahead and read this off. Jerome, Betty, whoever, feel free to chime in. So the first one is, so we know how many scams go around. Just wanted to understand how we would make this, make that text look authentic to the audience. Asking for money via text would have its own pros and cons. So I'm curious, Jerome, do you want to maybe answer that one?
Yeah. Well, if you're sending a text to your house list, I would definitely say, try to personalize the text. I mean, I don't know about other platforms, but with Prompt, you can put variable fields into the text message. So, mention that person's name, like, hi, Fars, this is Jerome from Stratcom, right? Introduce yourself just as you would in a telemarketing script, just as you would in if you did face-to-face fundraising. It's all about introducing yourself and building rapport, right? And that you're trying to build trust there. And this goes to your comments about using more casual language. Again, you're with all those channels, with any fundraising channel, you're trying to build rapport. because once you build rapport, you build trust, and you need trust to get that payment, right? So the donation. People are not going to give over their payment information if they don't have that trust.
Yeah, I love that. That goes literally back to what you'd mentioned earlier with the stewardship and the use case
Exactly.
conversation. That's fantastic. The second question, oh, sorry, Betty, did you want to chime in on that one as well?
Yeah, I wanted to mention one trick, I guess, or one strategy you could incorporate is if you're linking back to a donation page for folks, really good to have like a vanity URL that kind of shows that you're sending a link from your own charity's website, not bit.ly or Google because we found that that depresses click-through rates because, you know,
It looks
most
spammy.
folks know, most folks know not to trust like a bit.ly link from an unknown sender. So definitely
That is
avoid
a great suggestion. Something I heard about those vanity URLs that from somebody else was a fantastic idea was you can actually incorporate part of your messaging into the URL itself, right? So it could be like support the mission or something along those lines. Like there's details around that and nuance around that, but the vanity URL itself, in addition to being more clickable because it's not a bit.ly link, could also be part of the message. So that's great. The second question here is, it used to be people wanted a live body to make the ask. Are people okay today with asks coming by text? Which kind of dovetails off what you said, Jerome, but curious if you wanted to add any color to that.
Yeah, again, I think it's a medium that people need to get used to, right? And that's part of the rapport building and the trust building. But we've been surprised sometimes at how much people give. Actually, like they're actually with Alzheimer's Society, we were very surprised so our assumption going into this was, oh yeah, text by and large will be like small one-time gifts, right? $20, maybe $50. But actually with Alzheimer's Society, we were very surprised in our first campaign. We got a $1,000 donation, right? So I think with fundraising, it kind of underlines the fact that sometimes things are not intuitive, right? And this is why you need to test, and this is why you got to try things. Obviously, that donor was previous donor probably had been cultivated or stewarded through other mediums, but maybe just decided, hey, this is a really convenient way for me to make my donation that I want to give this year, and ended up doing it by text. So don't assume that your campaign will necessarily perform in a given way. Sometimes there are results that will, surprise you.
Awesome. The next question has to do with credit card expiration. Has anyone ever used text to update credit card expiration information? Not sure what the compliance considerations are for something like that, but curious if you all have that experience at Stratcom.
No, we would not probably do that. That would probably not sort of qualify as PCI compliant. You probably have to update the information on some kind of PCI compliant web form. So you could do it, but you wouldn't do it just by text. You would ask people, hey, your expiry date is common past. Would you please share your new one? Send this keyword. Then we would return a link, and if you could provide a link to a PCI compliant web form where you can capture that, that would probably be the best way of approaching it.
And one question there from Hank was, do you offer payment methods directly from inside the text? I think you answered that. You would link them out to something, a PCI compliant form. Okay.
Well, I should add, there's another thing that's going on in the UK where text is actually used far more frequently, which is vaulting of payments. Part of the problem here is convincing payment gateways to do this with you. But essentially what they're doing is, once a donor comes on, whether they're a one-time donor or a monthly donor, some sort of ask is made in whatever medium, face-to-face, telemarketing, or email. Would you let us vault your payment, your payment information, essentially your credit card? And about 30% of people are opting in, which gives the charity the permission to basically store the credit card. I mean, for monthly payments, you're storing the credit card anyway. And then in future asks, they just say, would you like to make this donation? And basically, Donors just have to say yes, and then it's processed because the card is vaulted. So that's a trend that's happening in the UK that I'd love to explore. If any of you clients want to try that and have a good in with your payment gateway, I'd love to do that. Love to try that.
So we are at time, and there's definitely more questions left. Look, if we didn't get to your question, I definitely advocate you please shoot us an email with it. Either it's myself, Jerome, or Betty. Our email addresses are listed here, and we'd love to get to them. There's so much more nuance that we could go into, and this was overall just broad strokes around things. But like I mentioned, every organization is different, and we handle them differently. And so please reach out to any one of the three of us, and we'll be more than happy to discuss your use case. That being said, thank you so much for attending. Jamal, thank you for hosting. Jerome, Betty, thank you for being on the panel. And we'll go ahead and leave this window up until we close out the Zoom. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Thanks, Fars.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Betty. Thanks, Jerome. We will have a recording. You will receive a recording if you registered for the webinar. We will be sending out the recording by the end of the week. And also, if you have any, if you want to see some guides around this, Prompt.io has a 5 tips on fundraising through text on our website, and that's prompt.io. Check it out, and definitely reach out to Betty and Jerome if you have any ideas or want to start, texting. So really appreciate everyone. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thank you.